he has spent the last 7 or 8 years watching as one Republican leader after another has, in his view, sold out their principles to rally around this brazenly unqualified and unstable demagogue.
Hello and welcome to The Interview. I'm Aidan McLaughlin, your host and the editor-in-chief of Mediaite. We've got a great guest for you this week. I am joined by McKay Coppins, a reporter and the author of a new biography, Romney: A Reckoning. The book sketches the life of Mitt Romney, most notably his shift from standard bearer of the Republican Party when he won its nomination for president in 2012 to a pariah when he was elected to the Senate as one of the few Republicans in Washington who publicly opposed then-President Donald Trump. We discuss the book, Romney's private thoughts on the Republican Party, and his plans for 2024. McKay, how are you doing?
I'm good, just on the tail end of the book tour here, so increasingly exhausted, but I'm having fun.
So, to start, tell me why you set out to write this book. What was the genesis of it? I read it over the weekend. It's fascinating. It's really, really fun to read, which I didn't think I would be saying about a biography of Romney, but it's truly fascinating. So what was the genesis of the idea to write this book and why you set out to write it?
Yeah, so I had covered Mitt Romney off and on for, more than 10 years when I approached him about writing this book. And, as a presidential candidate, I'd covered his campaign and, he was always sort of hyper controlled and disciplined and stuck to his talking points. And I always sensed there was more going on beneath the surface, but just had no access to it, and so after January 6th, I had profiled him when he arrived in the Senate for The Atlantic, and we had kind of kept in touch. And after January 6th, I could sense that some of that, angst that was often kind of bubbling beneath the surface was coming to the surface. And he seemed like he was in this sort of soul-searching mode. He was introspective. He was grappling with difficult questions about what had happened to his party and to the country, and was asking difficult questions of himself about his own career. And so, for a writer, that's like the perfect place you want your subject to be in, right? So I basically asked him, I would like to write a biography of you. I think you have a lot of stories to tell. I think you have seen a lot and said relatively little about it in public. But I sort of told him, I only want to do this if you feel like you're ready to tell those stories and be fully candid, because the worst case scenario of this book is, if he was still very cautious and trying to protect his relationships. And luckily for me, he was ready to be very candid. I could tell pretty early on, the first couple of interviews, he was very, very candid about, I think it was in one of the very first interviews, he told me a very large portion of my party doesn't really believe in the Constitution. And that is not the kind of thing you would hear Mitt Romney say in public. And it was kind of a revealing moment for me. A couple weeks later, he texted me and said, "Hey, I'm going to send you something that might be useful to look at before our next interview." And I looked at it, and it was just hundreds of pages of his personal journals. And from that point on, we were off. Like he gave me his journals, his email correspondence, text messages with Mitch McConnell. Like he was just handing everything over, and I had full editorial control over the book. He let me basically write what I felt like I had to write, and he couldn't veto anything. So that's sort of the genesis. It's very unusual to have a subject that is that open.
I know that was one of the most, I think, one of the best elements about the book, aside from your analysis, which I thought was great, of him and the Republican Party and American politics and how it's shifted over the years, is the fact that he was so candid. I mean, he truly gave you his unvarnished thoughts, and then you paired that with all of these personal communications. You got his journal, from what I understand, which he started in 2012, I think, all the way through now, which is obviously an incredible insight into anyone that you're writing a biography about. Why do you think he chose to give you access to all that? Is it because I think in a couple parts of the book, you note that he actually repeatedly in the book that he at certain points in his career had to stay silent, particularly after the ascent of Trump and his takeover of the Republican Party, where Romney had to stay silent, but then he's screaming in either emails to his advisors or his personal journal, like saying the things he truly wanted to say. Do you think he had like one last chance to give like a primal scream where he could really be honest with someone about what he felt about politics at the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say earlier in his career, especially, he was often holding in what he really thought, especially as he was trying to be presidential campaigns demand of their candidates basically that they censor themselves. And he was
Right.
constantly censoring himself, right? Um, with the rise of Trump, he would sort of alternate between being an outspoken critic, but then, especially once he first got to the Senate, he thought that he could sort of just ignore Trump. Like he had this idea that he could steer the party away from Trumpism in part by just ignoring Trump altogether, right?
Yeah.
He said like part of the issue is that we're all just constantly obsessed with Donald Trump and we're responding to everything he says, and I'm just not going to deal with him. I'm going to have my own agenda and I'm going to push that and I'm going to try to enable and empower other Republicans to return to old-fashioned conservative values.
No one has accomplished that to this day.
It's impossible. It's impossible. And even now when Trump isn't in office,
he's in Mar-a-Lago and we still can't. Yeah. It's crazy.
He's the object around which all of our politics orbit, right? And Mitt Romney realized that. And, he kind of was forced into this situation during the first impeachment trial where he was one of the only Republicans who approached that trial as a trial instead of as kind of a political process where you just defend your party. And so I think he gave me his journals and he opened up to me. Yes, probably in part because he was ready to sort of unburden himself. He had been so disciplined for so long. He was sort of ready to say what he wanted to say. I think also, frankly, he was just like alarmed by what he had seen behind the scenes, especially in the Senate during the Trump years. Like he experienced and witnessed a level of hypocrisy and cynicism within his own caucus that alarmed him. And especially after he saw the kind of most dangerous consequences of that cynicism and hypocrisy on January 6th, where, his colleagues are knowingly lying to their constituents about the election being stolen and seeing, a mob break into the Capitol because they've been lied to and Mitt Romney kind of narrowly escaping that mob, I think sort of shook something loose in him. And he wanted to, issue a warning, right? Like he wanted to kind of tell Americans what he had seen, what was happening, and because he's very concerned about, the fragility of American democracy. He's not sure like how long this project can sustain itself if we're, if mobs are being incited by, lies and partisan posturing.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting parts of the book is when Romney gets to the Senate and he's gone from being, the standard bearer of the Republican Party and its nominee for president in 2012 to, in a lot of ways, a pariah in the party because of his vocal opposition to Donald Trump and his votes for his impeachment. And then he saw that there were these people in the Senate, the otherwise very smart people, senators that served with Romney, and and media figures who supported him in 2012, who were doing things like supporting Trump's lies about the 2020 election, even though they would privately concede that those were nonsense. And even after those lies sparked the riot on January 6th, I thought one of the most interesting examples that you have in there is Mitch McConnell, who's obviously an incredibly smart man, incredibly successful politician. And you have him comparing Trump to Mussolini. he said he told Romney that Trump should have been impeached. I think in the first
Sorry, wait, I'm
impeachment.
going to jump in. That was actually Kevin McCarthy who
Oh,
called him
okay.
Mussolini.
Even better.
McConnell.
Honest.
Well, and then but McConnell came up to Romney
Yeah.
and said, Trump is an idiot. He
Right.
doesn't think when he speaks. Like these are two of the main congressional Republican leaders who privately just hold Trump in enormous disdain,
Right.
but publicly are like, pledging their loyalty to him every day and defending him and doing his bidding. And that was just so like deeply upsetting to Romney.
Right. Right.
Like just how big the gap was between what his fellow Republicans said in public and what they said in private.
And also, someone like Mike Lee, who senator from Utah, who I believe it was Mike Lee and Ron Johnson Romney described, who opposed a promising bipartisan gun control bill after the Uvalde massacre, and were explicit behind closed doors when they were talking to their fellow Republican senators that the only reason that they were opposing that bill is because it was a midterm year and they didn't want to make a bad vote. So I think you can see that the book really traces Romney's disillusionment with the party. I'm wondering where he stands now with the Republican Party. Obviously, he's not going to run for re-election. And you kind of, I think, suggest in the book that that's because he doesn't see, he doesn't think that as the party, one, he may not get re-elected, and two, he doesn't think that the party is in a place where he could actually make any change.
Right.
What does he think of the Republican Party now?
I think he's increasingly alienated. I mean, he still identifies as a Republican right now for the time being. But by the time we finished our interviews, he was openly talking about leaving the party, starting a third party. He said, I have been alarmed to see how quickly the Republican Party has shed thoughtful, considerate people. And in his view, that what's left is kind of this core of what he calls angry, resentful individuals who, and institutions in the conservative media and in politics that seem designed to keep them that way, right? His sons don't identify as Republicans anymore. A lot of his best friends and most kind of long-term advisors have effectively left the party. He feels pretty isolated. And part of it is the kind of ideological transformation that's happened in the Trump years. The party's become more isolationist in foreign policy, more populist and prone to certain types of culture war in domestic policy. But I think it's also about the personality of the party, the character of the party. He has spent the last 7 or 8 years watching as one Republican leader after another has, in his view, sold out their principles to rally around this kind of brazenly, unqualified and unstable demagogue, right? That's how he feels about Donald Trump. And I think it's harder and harder for him to feel like he can associate himself with those people and with this party. So I don't know if he'll officially leave the party. I think it's possible. He certainly has talked to me about it. But I remember one meeting where we were at his kitchen table in his house in DC, and he was kind of describing, I think, something, outrageous that Matt Gaetz had recently said. And he had this moment where he kind of just looked at this fixed point on the table in front of him. And it was almost like he forgot I was there. And he said, sometimes I just wonder, how can I be a part of this party? and I think that that's kind of what's been going on inside his head for a long time.
Right. He's almost trapped in it now. To what extent do you think that he sees himself as complicit in some ways in the decline of the GOP and the takeover by Trump? You dwell on this in the book, and I'm always curious as to how much he has reckoned with that, whether he thinks it's a legitimate argument, whether he has made mistakes in terms of, cozying up to Trump in 2012. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I asked him about this a few different times, and it was kind of in some ways the question that hovered over all of our conversations,
Hmm.
right? Like, to what extent was his early embrace of Donald Trump, and it was a tepid embrace, right? Like he accepted Trump's endorsement in 2012. I report about the machinations behind the scenes that led to that happening. Romney didn't want to accept his endorsement. He thought he was a buffoon. He had actually known Trump since the 90s and thought of him as kind of like this entertaining loudmouth, but not a serious political figure. He goes back and forth on the Trump element of this in particular. His basic position is that while he says he regrets if he gave Trump any credibility by accepting his endorsement, he doesn't really believe that um, his early embrace of him was the reason Trump became president.
Hmm.
But he does kind of cop to, throughout his pursuit of the presidency, doing things that he wouldn't otherwise do and taking positions he wouldn't otherwise take to court the right wing of his party, right? And a
Right.
lot of the stories in the book are about him trying to hold on to his beliefs and principles while also feeling like he needed to do and say certain things to win Republican primary voters in the national electorate, right? And that it was never a perfect fit. Mitt Romney is not a movement conservative,
Hmm.
and so it was always awkward. But I think that a lot of those stories are really revealing of how political leaders end up slowly kind of morphing into something that they that isn't totally true to themselves because politics demands it. I give Mitt Romney a lot of credit for his self-awareness about that, and for his willingness to sort of grapple with it in a way that very few sitting politicians do. But I think that when it comes to Trump, Mitt Romney is in some ways emblematic of the whole sort of establishment wing of the Republican Party, right? For so long, Mitt Romney type Republicans thought that they could court and coddle and indulge the far right elements of their base, and get their votes, but then stay in charge. Right?
Hmm.
The idea was we'll do what we need to do to keep them energetic and voting for us. But then after the election's over, we're still in charge. And
And
what happened with
what's the
Donald Trump?
harm?
Yeah, exactly. What's the
Right.
harm? And what happened with Donald Trump in 2016 is that those elements of the party took over.
Took
And now
over.
Mitt Romney is kind of on the fringe,
Yeah.
right?
There's the harm right there. Yeah. Yeah. No, I do think he's.
Yeah.
I mean, just my personal opinion, but I do feel like he's probably a little bit hard on himself in that regard because everyone enabled Trump in 2016. Everyone in a position of
Hmm.
power, Morning Joe had him on for those like gab sessions. Like it was pretty, CNN did the shots of the podium. It was a pretty universal obsession with this character, this sort of gaudy character, and I don't think anyone was really thought that that would
Well,
end up with him in the White House.
Well, and Mitt Romney, and I think this is why he struggles to take on too much responsibility for Trump's rise. Mitt Romney in 2016 remained an outspoken critic and opponent of Donald Trump
Right.
publicly, and even as a lot of the rest of his party kind of lined up behind him once he won the nomination, he also worked extensively behind the scenes, and I report on this in the book, to try to stop Trump from clinching the Republican nomination. And
Right.
you can read about kind of all the backstage machinations that ultimately failed, but like he was doing more than most prominent Republicans to stop Trump. And that's why I think that when this question of complicity comes up, he wants to sort of like engage with these questions of where he fell short and how his mistakes might have led to this moment. But he also doesn't want to take too much responsibility because he feels like he's done more than almost any other member of his party to stop Trump
Right.
in the last, since 2016.
So one really fascinating sequence in the book is when you describe his experience on January 6th. He was at the Capitol. Describe that day for us and what he experienced specifically.
Yeah, well, it really starts a few days earlier on January 2nd. He got a text from Angus King, the senator from Maine, saying, "Hey, call me. It's important." Romney calls him, and he finds out from Angus King that people in the Pentagon have been tracking kind of right-wing extremist chatter online. And, there's some concern about Mitt Romney's personal safety on January 6th, the day that the President Trump is going to hold this big rally to stop the steal, right? But there's all kinds of other threats, right? And so after Mitt Romney kind of is briefed on these threats from his Senate colleague, he hangs up and he texts Mitch McConnell and says, effectively, hey, listen, I don't know how much you've heard about this, but it seems like things could get really bad on January 6th. And he lays out the worst case scenario. He says there are calls to burn down your home, Mitch, to smuggle guns into DC, and to storm the Capitol. He showed me this text. He literally said that. And he said, I hope that we have sufficient security protocols in place, but I'm concerned that the person who commands the National Guard is the one instigating the unrest, the president, right? Mitch McConnell never responds to that.
Which is staggering. Absolutely astonishing that he never responded to that text.
So you can imagine 4 days later when Mitt Romney is in the Senate chamber and he's getting texts from his aide, how he feels about this, right? So he has an aide who's corresponding with the Capitol Police and kind of telling him, hey, things are getting pretty bad out here. I think you should go to your Senate hideaway, which is this small windowless room near the chamber. And Mitt Romney doesn't want to leave. He kind of says, let me know if they get inside the building. Then a minute or two later, he gets a text saying they've overcome the barriers. Effectively, they're going to be inside the building soon. So Mitt Romney leaves the chamber, starts to head to his hideaway. And as he's walking to the hideaway, he sees a Capitol Police officer sprinting in the opposite direction and tells him, get back inside the chamber. Like, you're not safe out here. Get back inside. So then Mitt Romney turns around and starts to run. He gets back to the chamber just in time to see the gavel drop and the Secret Service come in and basically remove Mike Pence from the chamber. And all of a sudden, the whole room turns over to chaos. There's security officials yelling at the senators to get further inside. They're trying to close and lock the doors. And in the middle of all this, Mitt Romney just totally loses it, which is pretty rare for Mitt Romney, right? He's a pretty controlled guy, but he just totally loses his temper, turns to Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz. They're kind of a group of right-wing senators who have been, spreading the lie about the election. And he just starts to yell at them. And there are different accounts of exactly what he says, but it effectively is, this is your fault. You did this. And I think it just speaks to how angry he was about not just, Donald Trump lying about having lost the election, but how many of his colleagues who he believes, he told me Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley are some of the smartest people in the Senate. And he said, it's so disingenuous, right? He knows that they don't actually believe the lies that Donald Trump is telling, but they have to pretend to kind of appease the Trump base. And that more than anything drives Mitt Romney crazy.
I mean, watching it as a spectator, I mean, we were, covering it as journalists, but it was maddening enough. I can only imagine being a senator, having warned against Trump's lies, then having warned Mitch McConnell that there could be violence that day, then seeing it happen, and then seeing senators continue to try and challenge the election results. I mean, I can't even imagine how angry I would be if I were in his position. And
he still gets angry. It's funny. Every time I bring it up with him, he gets angry all over again.
Yeah, I don't blame him.
It's like he goes back to that moment.
What's shocking about it is that it's still an open question, right? Like, I remember that day there were, most leaders of the Republican Party came out and said this was explicitly Trump's fault. Fox hosts on Fox News who had been subservient to Trump for 4 years said that this was a dark day in U.S. history. And so soon after, within days, that was all being turned around. And you write that Romney actually thought that the revisionism of January 6th was almost as bad as the attack itself. One of the people that has been crucial in aiding that revisionism is his own niece, Ronna McDaniel, who's the head of the RNC. What does he make of those attempts from conservative media, from the Republican members of Congress, from his own niece to whitewash what happened on January 6th and to basically forgive Trump for that day and present him now as a palatable political figure?
I think he's very frustrated by the revisionism. I think he's frustrated by the conservative media and Republican leaders who seemed to get close to kind of disavowing Trump or disowning him, and then went right back to their old pattern of excusing and defending and justifying. The Ronna McDaniel case is interesting because I asked him a few different times about his niece, who's the head of the RNC. And he always, that was like what the one person, one of very few prominent Republicans who he would sort of become a little bit more nervous about or careful about what he said because it's a family thing, right?
Right.
And what he told me is that they don't talk very often about politics. They clearly disagree. But there was one moment when he did call her up to kind of confront her about something. And it was, I don't know how long after January 6th, but the RNC put out a statement seeming to call the riots in the Capitol that day legitimate political speech, and sort of defending what happened. And Romney was just beside himself that one of the two major parties in America its institutional voice would put out a statement like that. So he actually called up Ronna and sort of said, "What's going on here?" And she walked it back and she said, that the statement's being taken out of context, et cetera. And the RNC did actually walk it back after publicly a little bit. But right. It's interesting because he said that he, on some level, he understood where Ronna was coming from, but he felt like the people in the RNC and just all these institutional Republicans who were trying to thread this needle of being not pro-insurrection, but still defending Donald Trump and remaining allies to him, they were playing with fire, right? And right. What he told me is that this is the challenge that we all face as Republicans in this era, which is that we all tell ourselves, if we just skirt this line or cross this one line, it'll be worth it because we'll be able to stay in our positions of power. And if we lose our positions, then someone really crazy or really bad will take our positions from us, right? And so it makes sense to kind of do what we need to do to stay in power. And he said the problem is that in this era, as a Republican, the line just keeps getting moved and moved and moved and moved. And you end up kind of taking these more extreme positions that you never thought you would. And I think in some ways, Mitt Romney sympathizes with that because he saw that in his own career earlier on. And now he's seeing people like Ronna McDaniel and other Republicans do the same thing. And, he understands where the impulse comes from, but he also wishes he could kind of tell them like it's not worth it.
Right. Yeah. See, as he says to about J.D. Vance, a seat in the Senate is not worth selling your soul.
Right.
And I think there's also no question that conservative media, whether it's Rush Limbaugh, primetime at Fox News, over the last couple decades created this really tough climate for Republican politicians where all compromise is seen as tantamount to betrayal, any deviation from subservience to Trump, treason. And that trend has been growing since, Newt Gingrich was running the show in the 1990s, of course. But the consequence now is that it purges the Republican Party of Trump critics and insulates him from any valid criticism. It does seem like Romney... Does Romney recognize that? What does he think of conservative media, of Fox News, of Rush Limbaugh, and the effect that they've had on the Republican Party?
Yeah, it's funny because he he was never a movement conservative himself. So until
Right.
he started running for president, he really didn't pay much attention to conservative media. He told me, I never read the National Review. I didn't listen to conservative talk radio. Like, he sort of thought all of that was a sideshow, right? And it wasn't really until his 2012 presidential campaign when he had an advisor who was basically, his like right wing whisperer who told him, like, you need to pay attention to these people. Sean
Right.
Hannity is an important figure in your world now, right? And all these magazines and radio shows and Fox News, that they're important. And so when he was running for president, he sort of would learn to speak their language, and he would be on Fox all the time. And he did develop like a friendship with, or what he thought was a friendship with, people like Sean Hannity. And there's a story in the book about how once he became a senator, and he was a vocal opponent of Donald Trump's, uh, all of a sudden, all these former media allies in conservative media were turning on him. And he was sort of taken aback. He was like, "Wait a second! I thought we were all friends, right?" And so there was one case where Sean Hannity did this like especially withering segment about Mitt Romney on his show, sort of calling him, this guy, like a swamp creature or whatever. And Romney thought, he's like, "I just need to call Sean. We'll clear the air. It's fine." And so he called up Sean Hannity, and he thought that they could sort of have a friendly conversation about where they disagreed. And instead, Hannity immediately tore into him and was saying, "Why aren't you supporting Trump? Why are you doing this?" And it got more and more agitated. The conversation got more and more heated. At one point, I thought this was funny. Sean Hannity, and this was early in the process, but Sean Hannity said, "You're so outraged about Donald Trump. Why aren't you more outraged about Burisma?" And Romney, who doesn't immerse himself in conservative media, like, didn't know what Burisma was shorthand for. And he said, "Well, what's Burisma?" And Hannity just exploded and went, "How do you not know what Burisma is?"
I can't think of anything that would make Sean Hannity more angry than a Republican senator not knowing what Burisma is. Not being
But it
read
just
in
spoke
on,
to,
yeah,
yeah, like, how do you not know the time,
the
I
latest
mean,
Hunter Biden thing. Yeah.
exactly. And so, Romney's embrace of and embrace by the conservative media was always an awkward arranged marriage,
Mm,
right? And the fact that they're now on opposite sides kind of makes more sense. But he does now recognize the kind of the problem of the conservative media, which is that the increasingly there's no room for conservatives who disagree with each other, right?
right.
The most popular conservative media is all about maintaining the party line, right? And Mitt Romney has now become a villain in the conservative media, and he realizes that, and he recognizes how kind of toxic the effect of certain, Fox News hosts and right wing talk radio is, in a way that he didn't realize it when he was running for president, because they were all lined up behind him, right?
Right.
And it's
Right.
much harder to see the problems in a certain structure when it's there to support you.
You write in the book about how Romney, I believe, considered an independent run in a previous election to stop Trump. Oprah
Hmm.
Winfrey may have been involved, and I was thinking about that when I was reading this, and we saw the New York Times poll that came out this week that has Democrats all petrified because it shows Trump beating Biden in a number of swing states, 5 out of the 6 battleground states that they had selected. Eh, Looking forward towards 2024, do you think there's any chance that Romney, or do you think he's considering, even thinking about possibly an independent run or some sort of other mechanism for ensuring Trump does not get reelected? Because, for all of his disagreements with Biden on policy, he clearly sees Trump as a much greater threat to American democracy than
I think
a
that's
Democrat.
I think that's right. I don't know if he has, if he would run as a third party candidate. He did consider it. In fact, he talked to me about it earlier this year. There was a moment when he seemed to be sort of actively planning a third party presidential bid. There are people in his circle who wanted him to do it in 2024. he ultimately was convinced that any third party bid by somebody like Mitt Romney would inadvertently end up helping Trump. And
Right.
he doesn't want to do anything that would help Trump or peel votes away from Joe Biden. He disagrees with Joe Biden on a lot of policy issues, but like you said, he sees Biden as somebody who fundamentally respects the Constitution, is in line with the mainstream of what an American president should be, and he sees Donald Trump as a real threat and a terrible example. Right? That's part of this is character. He just thinks that Donald Trump's misogyny and racism and his constant lying are just a bad example for the country, and there's a trickle down effect. So I don't know. I wonder what he'll do in 2024, but I believe that he will have a very hard time staying on the sidelines. He's going to be very committed to doing what he can to keep Trump out of the White House.
Which will be very interesting to watch. What did Mitt Romney think of the book?
So our deal was that he could read the book before it was published, but that he couldn't, dictate changes. Right. I would be the ultimate arbiter of what stayed in the book.
He could put his fury at it in his journal.
He could vent about it.
Vent about it in his journal. Yeah.
Or I told him, if he wanted to have a good faith conversation about things in the book that he disagreed with or thought were wrong, I would do that. I thought that was a fair, a fair thing to do as his biography. I think, it's funny. He read the book over a weekend in the spring, and I thought maybe he would kind of hang back and take some time to process. And the next time we saw each other, he would sort of have his thoughts crafted. Instead, he was live texting me his reaction throughout as he read it throughout the weekend.
That
which
sounds terrifying.
Made for a very unnerving weekend.
How terrifying is it to share? Yeah, go ahead. I wanted to ask how terrifying it is to share a sweeping biography like this with its subject. I mean, I would be petrified.
I mean, it is. It's a weird. It's just a really weird thing. I obviously wanted him to feel that I'd done his story justice, but we just disagree on certain things. And the way I characterize some things, I also interviewed a number of people who weren't Mitt Romney for this book, and he probably disagrees with them on certain elements of his life and career. But to his credit, after he read it, we did have some conversations about, things that he thought were lacking context or whatever. But to his credit, what he said in the end was, "This is your book. It's not my book. I could have chosen to write a memoir, and I decided not to, in part because, as he told me in our very first meeting, I can't be objective about my own life."
Right.
And I think that shows a lot of self-awareness for a political figure of his stature. So, there are things he doesn't like in the book, but I think overall it's a fairly, empathetic portrait of a complicated guy who's living in a very complicated time. And I think he's made his peace with it.
Well, the book is brilliant. It's fascinating. I encourage everyone to go out, buy it, and read it. Romney, A Reckoning by McKay Coppins. McKay, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Interview. Please subscribe to The Interview on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And check out coverage of my conversation with McKay Coppins on MediaIte.com.